Romanticism Re-Examined by René Wellek. In a long paper, The Concept of Romanticism in Literary History, published in the first two numbers of the newly founded journal Comparative Literature, 1949, I tried to refute the thesis propounded by A.O. Lovejoy that the term romantic means nothing, that the romanticism of one country may have little in common with that of another, and that the romantic ideas were in large part heterogeneous, logically independent, and sometimes essentially antithetic to one another in their implications. I was distressed at the general acceptance of Lovejoy's thesis by the American academic community. Scholars had given up such questions in despair and settled down to an investigation of facts and the interpretation of individual poems. I felt that Lovejoy's extreme nominalism encouraged shirking the larger issues of literary history, the concepts of period, movement, development, and the whole question of the unity and diversity of European cultural change. Lovejoy, an eminent historian of ideas, paradoxically contributed to the anti-historical drift of recent American literary scholarship. In that article, I traced the history of the terms romantic and romanticism in order to show the large measure of agreement about their meaning during the age in all countries. I collected evidence which proved that even without the use of the terms, the consciousness of a specific change was universal at that time. And finally, I tried to demonstrate, in a very empirical way, that the poetry of the early 19th century has many features in common. The new views of nature, imagination, and the use of symbol are all pervasive in Europe, and they are, pace Lovejoy, obviously coherent and mutually implicate each other. Lovejoy has not defended his thesis, but he has reasserted it in the preface to a little book, The Reason, the Understanding, and Time, 1961, which analyzes some ideas of Schelling, Jacobi, Schopenhauer, and Bergson. Lovejoy reprints the crucial passages of his earlier essays in order to justify his avoidance of calling these philosophers romantic. Ronald S. Crane, whom I had quoted dismissing the fairy tales about neoclassicism and romanticism in the 18th century, commented at some length on my article. He did not object to historical generalizations, which would describe the change in the terms I had selected, but he considered my passion for unity excessive. He demanded literal proof. He wanted me to show sameness in the literal sense of the terms of imagination, nature, and symbol in all the writers discussed. Crane has set me an impossible task. I do not see how anybody can prove a literal identity exclusive of all individuality. This would imply a monolithic period such as could not be found at any time in history. In all my writings, I have consistently argued for a period concept which allows for the survival of former ages and the anticipations of later ones. Period demands the dominance, but not the total tight dictatorial rule, of a set of norms which, in the case of Romanticism, are provided sufficiently by similar or analogous concepts of the imagination, nature, symbol, and myth. I am content with Crane's admission of such generalizations, and I grant that Lovejoy, in The Great Chain of Being and in some later papers, actually operates with concepts such as organicism, dynamism, and diversitarianism, which are descriptive of what usually is called romantic. The mere avoidance of the term in Lovejoy's new book on Schelling and his followers solves nothing. Morse Peckham, in a widely noted article, Toward a Theory of Romanticism, wanted, he says, to reconcile Lovejoy and Wellek, and Lovejoy with himself, by singling out the criterion of organic dynamism as the definition of Romanticism. Peckham thus accepts the concept of nature and imagination as described in my article, but he drops the concern for symbol and myth. Peckham introduces a new concept, negative romanticism, that is, despairing, nihilistic romanticism. The argument runs that positive romanticism does not fit Byron, but that negative romanticism does. I am supposed to be unable to come to terms with this phenomenon. Still, it seems to me that little has been accomplished by calling familiar states of mind, Weltschmerz, mal du siècle, pessimism, negative romanticism. It is a purely verbal solution, as if we should call naturalism negative symbolism, or symbolism negative naturalism. By showing the coherence of the point of view which other writers as well as I have called romanticism, its organicism, its use of the creative imagination, its symbolic and mythic procedures, we have excluded nihilism, alienation, from our definition. A man who considers nature dead and inimical to man, who considers imagination merely a combinatory associative power and who does not use symbolic and mythic devices, is not a romanticist in the sense in which Wordsworth, Novalis, and Hugo are romantic. Since the 1951 article, Morse Peckham has changed his mind. In a new essay, Toward a Theory of Romanticism, Reconsiderations, 1961, Peckham abandons his early scheme in favor of a grandiose cultural history of the modern age, which he has also developed in a book, Beyond the Tragic Vision, 1962. Peckham now calls Romanticism Enlightenment, as he has been apparently deeply impressed by Ernest Tuveson's The Imagination as a Means of Grace, Locke and the Aesthetics of Romanticism, 1960. But Tuveson, though excellent on Lockean influences on 18th century British aesthetics, cannot show that imagination was considered a means of grace at that time. In any case, the break with the Lockean tradition is precisely a crucial test of Romantic aesthetics. I need only allude to Coleridge's rejection of Locke or to Schelling's view of Locke's bestialities, reported by Henry Crabb Robinson. Be that as it may, Peckham now believes the essence of Romanticism to be the imposition of order on chaos, a heroic, anti-metaphysical subjectivism which reminds one rather of Bertrand Russell's A Free Man's Worship than of the outlook of a Wordsworth, a Friedrich Schlegel, or a Lamartine. Peckham takes a quite unjustified view of Kant as a kind of pragmatist. Romanticism learns from Kant, he says, that it can do entirely without constitutive metaphysics and can use any metaphysic or world hypothesis as supreme fiction. I'm not aware of a single writer in the late 18th or the early 19th century to whom this description would apply. Who then rejected the possibility of metaphysics or treated it as supreme fiction? Not even Friedrich Schlegel, whose theory of irony exposed him to the charge of probabilism, opportunism, and aestheticism. I'm afraid Peckham's reconsiderations do not contribute to a better definition of Romanticism. It seems only right that he avoids the term in Beyond the Tragic Vision. Reading Peckham, one is tempted to give up the problem in despair. We might come to agree with Lovejoy, or even with Valéry, who warns us that it is impossible to think seriously with words such as classicism, romanticism, humanism, or realism. One cannot get drunk or quench one's thirst with labels on a bottle. But of course, these terms are not labels. They have a range of meaning very different from Pabst Blue Ribbon or Lieb Frauenmilch. Modern logicians tell us that all definitions are verbal, that they are stipulated by the speaker. We certainly cannot prevent communists from calling dictatorship popular democracy, a baby from calling any strange man daddy, or even Peckham from calling Romanticism enlightenment. But there is a sense, I am quoting Wilbur Urban, in which the distinction between verbal and real definition is a valid one. There comes a point at which variation ceases to be merely inconvenient and unpragmatic. It becomes unintelligible. It leads to contradictio in adjecto, in which intrinsic incompatibility between subject and predicate destroys the meaning by an implicit denial. We can dismiss people who speak of square circles or call Romanticism enlightenment. We need not even consider our task identical with that of the lexicographer, who has to document the full range of usage of a term. We shall rather try to show that there is a growing area of agreement and even convergence among the definitions, or, more modestly, descriptions of Romanticism as they have been attempted by responsible scholars in recent decades in several countries. Incidentally, I hope, the survey will bring out the differences in methods and approaches characteristic of literary scholarship in Germany, France, England, and the United States, but precisely the varieties of national traditions, which are often only in tenuous contact with each other, will make the basic consensus about the nature of Romanticism stand out all the more convincingly. In Germany, in the early 20s, a whole series of books was devoted specifically to definitions of the nature or essence of Romanticism. Germans operate, or rather operated, with dichotomies, thesis and antithesis, vast contrasts such as idea and form, idea and experience, rationalism and irrationalism, perfection and infinitude, etc. Max Deutschbein, in Das Wesen des Romantischen, 1921, aims at a phenomenological intuition of the essence of Romanticism by showing the agreement between English and German Romanticism in their concept and use of the synthetic imagination, the union of opposites, the finite and infinite, eternity and temporality, universality and individuality. The scheme serves the conclusion that English poetry translated German theory into practice But, of course, the amazing identities which Deutschbein finds between German and English Romanticism are often due to the fact that his crown witness on the English side, Coleridge, is simply paraphrasing Schelling. Still, this neglected little book has stressed one central and valid concept, the reconciling synthetic imagination as the common denominator of Romanticism. The scheme of contrasts elaborated by Fritz Strich in Deutsche Klassik und Romantik oder Vollendung und Unendlichkeit, 1922, has a different starting point. Strich wants to transfer Wölflin's kunstgeschichtliche Grundbegriffe, 1915, to the history of literature. Wölflin ingeniously contrasted Renaissance and Baroque art on purely structural grounds such as open or closed form. Strich ties the contrast between classical and romantic art rather to man's quest for permanence or eternity. Eternity can be achieved either in perfection or in infinitude. The history of man oscillates between these two poles. Perfection wants repose. Infinitude, movement and change. Perfection is closed. Infinitude, open. Perfection is clear. The infinite is dark. Perfection seeks the image. Infinitude, the symbol. The transfer of Wölflin's categories from art history to literature is accomplished ingeniously, but one wonders whether the description of Romanticism as dynamic, open form, unclear, symbolic, and the like, does more than line up Romanticism with the Baroque, and with symbolism in the series of polar alternations between intellect and feeling which are supposed to constitute the history of Europe. It is the old separation into sheep and goats, a schematic device which obscures the historical particularities of the Romantic age in distinction from other open-form, dynamic, symbolic styles. Still, Strich and his many followers have been extraordinarily successful in bringing out these very broad changes in feelings and art forms which were hardly perceived before Wölflin and others devised the vocabulary for their description. The whole enterprise is apparently still a novelty in the United States. Thus, the philosopher W.T. Jones, in his new book, The Romantic Syndrome, 1961, makes the most extravagant claims for his discovery of a scheme which is very similar to that of many Germans. According to Jones, Romanticism is dynamic rather than static, prefers disorder to order, continuity to discreteness, soft focus to sharp focus, has an inner rather than an outer bias, and prefers an other world to this world. Jones seems unaware of the many typologies of this kind in Germany. The names of Dilthey, Sprenger, Jaspers, Jung, and Knoll do not occur anywhere in the book. The only theory known to Jones seems to be Wölflin's, to whom he refers in a footnote. Wölflin's categories, Jones admits, seem related to my axes, but Jones thinks that it is his discovery that these categories permit a cross-medium comparison between artistic productions and literary and philosophical works. Jones's analysis of artworks, of the contrast between Dürer and Rubens, Bellini and El Greco, is completely dependent on Wölflin. The application to Romantic poetry, which interests us here, never gets beyond the simplest observations. Romantic poetry prefers the misty, the hazy, the dim, the soft focus, Wölflin's unclearness. Inner bias is illustrated easily, so is preference for disorder, love of continuity, the other world, etc. Most of these are familiar themes, and Jones's examples seem often ill-chosen. He uses, for instance, quotations from Goethe's Faust without heeding the dramatic context. Jones's main contribution to typology is the ominous suggestion that it needs verification by quantification, the idea that a team of researchers should, for instance, make account of soft focus imagery in all the poems published in a given year. Jones imagines that by such statistical methods, it would be possible to give an objective date for the rise of Romanticism. I shall not urge the difficulties and uncertainties of this enterprise. The impossibility of establishing criteria for what is soft focus in imagery, and for defining an image, and of counting the images in every poem in all languages. One must rather reject the whole ideal of knowledge implied, the fashionable faith in statistics, the denial of the crucial issue of value and individuality. The many German definitions of Romanticism were surveyed by Julius Petersen in Die Wesensbestimmung der deutschen Romantik, 1926. Petersen welcomed each and every approach, including the racial, which makes Romanticism peculiarly German, and the regional, which makes it East German in particular. But at the time of his writing, the tide was beginning to turn. More and more reservations against the whole method were being voiced both inside and outside of Germany. Martin Schütze, a professor of German at the University of Chicago, made in his Academic Illusions, 1933, a neglected book now happily again available in a reprint, trenchant criticisms of the whole German phantasmagoria of polarities. Emil Steiger, just before the outbreak of the Second World War, announced in the preface to Die Zeit als Einbildungskraft des Dichters, 1939, that the task of literary study is interpretation, and he dismissed influences, biography, psychology, sociology, and typology from the inner sanctum. In his late years at Harvard, Karl Vitor voiced his conviction that the age of the geistesgeschichtlich approach and its methods is at an end. As far as I can ascertain, only 2 new German books about the nature of Romanticism have appeared since the end of the war. Adolf Grimme, in Vom Wesen der Romantik, 1947, defined Romanticism as a breakthrough of what he calls the vegetative strata of the soul, the preconscious rather than the subconscious. The preconscious includes the imagination, which is raised to consciousness by Romanticism. Grimme is more interesting in his theoretical defense of the method of phenomenology. A single example, he argues, must suffice, as we cannot deduce or generalize about Romanticism before we know what is meant by Romanticism. The aim of a verbal definition is illusory. We can only point to what is romantic as we can point to the color red. In a collection of lectures, Romantik, 1948, the well-known Jesuit philosopher Romano Guardini comes to a similar conclusion. Romanticism is an upsurge of the unconscious and primitive. The comparisons with English Romanticism made in Germany have become very cautious. Horst Oppel, in an article, Englische und Deutsche Romantik, 1956, makes much of the differences between the two countries. The prevalence of an empirical philosophy in England, the uniqueness of the German fairy tale, the rarity of romantic irony in England, and so forth. A British professor of German, writing in German, Udo C. Mason, has recently elaborated on the scheme in Deutsche und Englische Romantik, 1959. He rightly emphasizes the very different historical situation of the English Romantic poets, who were not confronted with such overpowering figures as those of Goethe and Schiller in Germany. He points to features in German Romanticism, such as a nihilistic daring, Satanism, decadentism, and extreme aestheticism which go far beyond the bourgeois limitations of Wordsworth or Coleridge. Mason makes much of the almost complete lack of understanding and contacts between the two countries. To my mind, he overemphasizes the timidity, orthodoxy, and prudery of the English poets. He plays up the role of Henry Crabb Robinson as the only person of the time who understood both Wordsworth and the German Romantics, though he must admit that Robinson was historically quite ineffective and that his published articles hardly reflect the presumed depth of his understanding. Robinson's attempt in 1829 to convert Goethe to Wordsworth by recruiting Ottilie von Goethe was pitifully inept. There was, one must conclude, no real meeting of minds, though a few physical encounters between Coleridge and Tieck, or Coleridge and August Wilhelm Schlegel. But surely the problem of the affinity between German and English Romanticism cannot be disposed of by showing that contemporary contacts were tenuous and personal sympathies far from perfect. There is, of course, plenty of research and interpretation in Germany of individual Romantic writers, but on the whole a strange silence has settled around the question of the nature or essence of Romanticism. In France, the situation is very different. Paul van Tighem attempted a synthesis of all European Romantic literatures in Le Romantisme dans la littérature européenne, 1948. Van Tighem attempts at writing literary history on a truly international scale. He draws liberally also from the small European literatures, including the Slavic and Scandinavian. He deliberately ignores national frontiers and orders his facts not according to a linguistic atlas, but by a psychological and aesthetic map of tendencies and tastes. Categories such as the feeling for nature, religion, love, exoticism, historicism, assemble a mass of information, but unfortunately never rise to any higher level of generalization. Oddly enough, Van Tighem can say that the suppression of the mythological style is probably the most universal trait of formal Romanticism. Van Tighem, though learned and acutely aware of the unity of Europe, lacks the esprit de finesse and remains disconcertingly external. An examination of recent definitions of Romanticism by Jean-Bertrand Barrère lists nothing new. He prefers to engage in a discussion of the different stages of French Romanticism, a historical task which is not our concern. Much more exciting and original are the studies of the group of critics who call themselves critics of consciousness, or the Geneva School. They seem to live in a world quite different from that of the older academic scholars. Albert Béguin's L'âme romantique et le rêve, 1939, studies German Romanticism and the French writers who, in his opinion, went the same way: Rousseau, Sénancourt, Nodier, Maurice de Guérin, Hugo, Nerval. He glances at Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Mallarmé, and Proust. Béguin is not particularly concerned with influences. His motivation is ultimately religious. The greatness of Romanticism resides for him in its having recognized and affirmed the profound resemblance of poetic states and the revelations of a religious order. But Béguin is also a scholar interested in defining the essence of Romanticism. Romanticism is to him a myth. Man invents myths in order to overcome his solitude and to reintegrate himself into the whole. He invents myths in a double sense. He finds them in the treasure house of history and discovers them in dreams and the unconscious. Béguin distinguishes three romantic myths: those of the soul, of the unconscious, and of poetry. Poetry is the only answer to the elemental anguish of the creature enclosed in his temporal existence. The analogical concept of the universe is assumed. The structure of our mind and our total being and its spontaneous rhythms are identical with the structure and the great rhythms of the universe. Béguin's horizon is confined to German and French literature. He focuses on the German theorists, speculative philosophers, and doctors of the unconscious, and studies sympathetically such writers as Jean-Paul, Novalis, Brentano, Arnim, and E.T.A. Hoffmann. A student of English Romanticism might conclude that he singles out the most irrationalistic writers and isolates the dream, the night, the unconscious unduly. But I believe that even for a parallel study of English developments, we would find in Béguin the finest understanding of the nature of the Romantic imagination and its rootedness in a sense of the continuity between man and nature and the presence of God. Georges Poulet, in his books and articles mainly concerned with the feeling of time and space, supports Béguin's conclusions by a somewhat different method. The early books, Études sur le temps humain and La distance intérieure, 1950-1952, are both devoted to individual French writers, though the appendix to the English translation of Studies in Human Time contains thumbnail sketches of American writers from Emerson to Henry James and T.S. Eliot. But in an article, Timelessness and Romanticism, 1954, and in a section, Le Romantisme, of the new book, Les Métamorphoses du Cercle, 1961, Poulet generalizes about Romanticism boldly. The article in the Journal of the History of Ideas tries to define the specific experience of time common to many Romantics, to Rousseau, Coleridge, De Quincey, Baudelaire. They all seem to have experienced paramnesia, the sensation of déjà vu, the total recollection which does not appear to be recollected. They all aimed, at least, at the total exclusion of the past from the present by a perfect absorption in the present, as if time stood still and became eternity. But Poulet rightly emphasizes that this romantic experience is not identical with its philosophical source, the Neoplatonic, simultaneous, and perfect possession of an interminable life. The Romantics did not want to describe an ideal world or the abstract existence of God in their poems. They wanted to express their own concrete experiences, their own personal apprehension of human timelessness. In brief, paradoxically, they brought eternity into time. In the new book, Poulet defines Romanticism in somewhat different terms, as a consciousness of the fundamentally subjective nature of the mind, as a withdrawal from reality to the center of the self, which serves as starting point for a return to nature. Poulet draws his examples of this back-and-forth movement of the mind mainly from French writers, but also from Coleridge and Shelley, quoting and using ingeniously, but over-insistently, the figures of the circle and circumference. Shelley's saying that poetry is at once the center and the circumference of knowledge pleases him as much as Coleridge's admiring an old coach wheel. See how the rays proceed from the center to the circumference, and how many different images are distinctly comprehended at one glance, as forming one whole, and each part in some harmonious relation to each and all. The wheel is the symbol of beauty, of organic wholeness, of the unity of the universe. Poulet's conception of criticism had originally excluded the possibility of such generalizations about a period. Each author, according to Poulet, lives in his particular world construed by his own consciousness. The task of the critic is to enter this individual consciousness. But apparently Poulet now conceives of these consciousnesses as unified in an all-embracing spirit of the time. He boldly generalizes about the Renaissance, the Baroque, and Romanticism. Romanticism, not only French or German, but all Romanticism, is defined by this effort to overcome the opposition of subject and object, of center and circumference, in a personal experience. The same view is advanced by Albert Gérard in L'idée romantique de la poésie en Angleterre, 1955, and summarized in an article on the logic of Romanticism, 1957. Gérard also rejects as inadequate the older generalizations about Romanticism, its emotionalism, cult of spontaneity, primitivism, and the like, and he examines minutely, by traditional methods, the views common to Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats. Byron is expressly excluded, of the poetic experience as a form of knowledge, an intuition of cosmic unity conceived as a matter-spirit continuum. The philosophy of creativity, the union of subject and object, the role of the symbol and myth are expounded by Gérard with ample documentation. The results will strike us as not particularly new. Gérard brings, however, welcome corroboration to recent studies of Romantic theory. I need only allude to Meyer Abrams's The Mirror and the Lamp, 1953, and to the second volume of my History of Modern Criticism, 1955. Abrams emphasizes the shift from imitation theory to theory of expression, from the mirror to the lamp, or rather from the mechanistic metaphorical analogies of neoclassical theory to the biological imagery of the Romanticists. He pays some attention to the German background of English theories. In my own book, I give a full exposition of the Germans and distinguish between a Romantic movement in a wider sense, as a revolt against neoclassicism, and a Romantic movement in a more special sense, as the establishment of a dialectical and symbolist view of poetry. It thus seems a firmly established fact that there was a coherent Romantic theory of poetry, which has been defined and analyzed. Poetic theory implies a philosophical attitude and a poetic practice, certainly in the Romantic age. An agreement on the basic outlook of the Romantics on reality and nature and on the main devices used by the Romantic poets has also been reached among recent English and American students. What matters in a study of poetry is the function of the Romantic view of nature. The structure of Romantic nature imagery, 1949, was explored by W.K. Wimsatt. He shows how the metaphor organizes a Romantic nature poem, how, for example, the landscape in Coleridge's sonnet to the river otter is both the occasion of reminiscence and the source of the metaphors by which reminiscence is described, how the Romantic poems blur the distinction between literal and figurative because the poet wants to read a meaning into the landscape, but also wants to find it there. Meyer H. Abrams in The Correspondent Breeze, A Romantic Metaphor, 1957, shows how this recurrent image represents the chief theme of continuity and interchange between outer motions and interior life and powers in many important Romantic poems, such as Coleridge's Dejection, an Ode, and Wordsworth's Prelude. Abrams refuses to be drawn into inferences about archetypal patterns. He argues that this mode of reading eliminates the individuality of a poem and threatens to nullify even its status as a work of art. Several other sensitive studies, mostly concerned with Wordsworth, have recently led to the same conclusion. For example, Jeffrey Hartman's paper, A Poet's Progress, Wordsworth and the Via Naturaliter Negativa, 1962, describes how nature itself led the poet beyond nature. But the nature is not nature as such, but nature indistinguishably blended with imagination, or, as Hartman formulates it paradoxically, the imagination experienced as a power distinct from nature opens the poet's eyes by putting them out. Another writer, Paul de Man, in a paper entitled Symbolic Landscape in Wordsworth and Yeats, 1962, describes this double vision which allows Wordsworth to see landscapes as
objects as well as entrance gates to a world lying beyond visible nature. Wordsworth's transcendental vision is contrasted with Yeats's emblematic landscape. David Ferry, in The Limits of Mortality, an essay on Wordsworth's major poems, 1959, seems to overstate Wordsworth's hatred for the mortal limitations of man. He misconceives his mood, I believe, but he sees that nature is, in Wordsworth, a metaphor for eternity, for the absence of death, that the theory of symbolism posits as its ground the double consciousness, whereby the objects of nature may have individual and particular identity in themselves as objects, yet will stand figuratively for the whole of which they really are part. In Earl Wasserman's turgid and forced interpretations, both in the book on Keats, called The Finer Tone, 1953, and in the more recent The Subtler Language, 1959, we find this awareness that the poetic act is creative both of a cosmic system and of the poem made possible by that system. Wasserman hardly overstates romantic individualism when he says that the creation of a poem is also the creation of the cosmic wholeness that gives meaning to the poem, and each poet must independently make his own world picture, his own language within language. This ambition justifies the romantic concern for symbolism and mythology, and for a symbolism and mythology which is individual and private, relies on personal vision, and hence is open to the most diverse and often contradictory interpretations. The most influential study of romantic key images and myths was G. Wilson Knight's Starlit Dome, 1941. We all have learned from Wilson Knight. I suspect that even Georges Poulet has read him with profit. His spatial approach, the way of seeing a poem or a play at once in a single view, like a patterned carpet, has become the model of many later readings. But most of us have become increasingly dissatisfied with the arbitrariness of his associations, the intrusion of a crude psychoanalysis and of a strangely misused Nietzsche. Few of us can share the odd exaltation of Byron to a symbolist and prophet to the greatest man after Christ. But in the chapter, The Wordsworthian Profundity, Knight comes to the right conclusion that Wordsworth aims at a fusion of mind with nature to create the living paradise, to which, however, in Knight's opinion, Shelley and Keats bear stronger immediate witness than Wordsworth. Knight's themes have been pursued by others, often with a different emphasis. W. H. Auden's The Enchafed Flood, the romantic iconography of the sea, 1950, centers on the longing for the sea from Wordsworth to Mallarmé, with emphasis on Moby Dick. Auden sees a dialectic of consciousness and unconsciousness. Romanticism means the identification of consciousness and sin. The Romanticist yearns for innocence because he is traveling farther and farther from unconsciousness. In the introduction to the fourth volume of Poets of the English Language, 1950, Auden states the same conclusion somewhat differently. As self-consciousness is the noblest human quality, the artist as the most conscious man becomes the romantic hero. But the idol of consciousness is a pantheistic god immanent in nature. In the same year, F.W. Bateson concluded that the nature symbol, the synthetic link between the conscious and the subconscious mind, is the basic unit of romantic poetry. Also, R.A. Folks's The Romantic Assertion, 1958, describes the romantic system of symbols as serving the vision of harmony. In a rather obvious way, this romantic vocabulary of assertion is contrasted with the modern poetry of conflict and irony. On the other hand, Frank Kermode, in his Romantic Image, 1957, derives the modern symbol, mainly in Yeats, directly from Romanticism. The symbol of the French is the romantic image writ large and given more elaborate metaphysical and magical support. But Kermode considers symbolism a great and in some ways noxious historical myth, and wants to destroy the idea of the supernatural image and what he considers its inevitable accompaniment, the alienated artist, the artist as a pretentious prophet and seer. An opposite and emphatically positive evaluation of romantic mythology is made in Harold Bloom's The Visionary Company, 1961, a book which interprets closely all the main romantic poems with less polemical fervor than his earlier work on Shelley's mythmaking, 1959. Bloom exalts Blake and Shelley. Their vision is interpreted as Gnostic rapture transcending that of the more nature-bound Wordsworth and Keats. I find many of Bloom's readings totally unconvincing. Thus, he invokes Blake's inept picture of the tiger, a shabby pawn-shop sort of stuffed tiger, more an overgrown house cat, to misread the whole poem as a mockery, revealing a state of being beyond either innocence or experience, a state where the lamb can lie down with the tiger.
Nor are Wordsworth or Keats interpreted rightly. Bloom minimizes both the Christian and the Hellenic constituents of Romanticism. He sees only the prophetic, the visionary of the company. We shall not, I think, make much progress with the problem of Romanticism if we seek its prototype in such an exceptional and lonely figure as Blake, who seems to me rather a survival from another century, however much he may also anticipate the issues of our own time. What is called Romanticism in England and on the continent is not the literal vision of the mystics, but the concern for the reconciliation of subject and object, man and nature, consciousness and unconsciousness, to which we have returned several times. It is well brought out in two recent studies which deal with both English and continental Romanticism. E.D. Hirsch, in Wordsworth and Schelling, defines the convergence of these strikingly different figures in a whole spectrum of ideas, the way of reconciling time and eternity, the immanent theism, the dialectic which favors what Hirsch calls both-and thinking, the fear of alienation, the concept of living nature, and the role of the imagination, which makes explicit the implicit unity of all things. Hirsch construes a typology which he derives from Karl Jaspers's Psychologie der Weltanschauungen, 1919, and thus he avoids the question of common sources and influences. Surely, however, we must assume that the Neoplatonic tradition and the nature mysticism of Jakob Boehme, translated into 18th century terms, lies behind both Wordsworth and Coleridge, as well as Schelling. Paul de Man, in an article Structure intentionnelle de l'image romantique, 1960, redefines the nature of the romantic nature image. He uses passages about the high Swiss mountains from Rousseau, Wordsworth, and Hölderlin to show the peculiar paradox of the Romantic poet's nostalgia for the object. Language strives to become nature. The words must, in a phrase of Hölderlin's, arise like flowers, wie Blumen entstehen. Sometimes romantic thought and poetry seem about to surrender so completely to the nostalgia for the object that it becomes difficult to distinguish between object and image, between imagination and perception, between expressive and constitutive language, and mimetic and literal language. De Man thinks of passages in Wordsworth and Goethe, Baudelaire and Rimbaud, where the vision becomes almost a presence, a real landscape. But he argues that even the most extreme believer in the magic of language, Mallarmé, never doubted the intrinsic ontological primacy of the natural and earthly object. But the attempt of language to approach the ontological status of the object fails. Contradicting his statement a few pages before, de Man concludes that we have misunderstood these poets if we call them pantheists, while they are probably the first writers who, within the Western Hellenic and Christian tradition, have in their poetic language questioned the ontological primacy of the sensible object. Though de Man seems to waver on the issue of the Romantic's precise view of nature, he strongly corroborates our central theme. The reconciliation of art and nature, language and reality, is the Romantic ambition. In a recent essay, Romanticism and Anti-Self-Consciousness, 1962, Jeffrey Hartman has generalized about the common elements in English and German Romanticism. The peculiarly romantic remedy for the human predicament is the attempt to draw the antidote to self-consciousness from consciousness itself. The idea of a return to nature or naivete via knowledge is common to German and English Romanticism. He concludes that to explore the transition from self-consciousness to imagination and achieve that transition while exploring it is the most crucial romantic concern. The modern writer, while pursuing the same aim, has lost faith in the role of nature. In all of these studies, however diverse in method and emphasis, a convincing agreement has been reached. They all see the implication of imagination, symbol, myth, and organic nature, and see it as part of the great endeavor to overcome the split between subject and object, the self and the world, the conscious and the unconscious. This is the central creed of the great Romantic poets in England, Germany, and France. It is a closely coherent body of thought and feeling. We can, of course, still insist that there is also a unity of Romanticism on the lowest literary level, in the Renaissance of wonder, in the Gothic romance, in the interest in folklore, and in the Middle Ages. H. Remak, in a paper, West European Romanticism, Definition and Scope, 1961, has recently drawn up a large synoptic table where he lists many criteria proposed and answers yes or no, whether they apply to Germany, France, England, Italy, or Spain. He comes to the welcome conclusion that the evidence pointing to the existence in Western Europe of a widespread, distinct, and fairly simultaneous pattern of thought, attitudes, and beliefs associated with the connotation Romanticism is overwhelming, though Italy and Spain were the countries least affected by Romanticism. But his tables have the drawback of being atomistic.
The implication and coherence of the concepts of nature, imagination, and myth are not shown, and such old criteria as liberalism or vagueness and such ideas as rhetoric or greater positive emphasis on religion are given an undeserved status. I dislike being called the champion of the concept of a pan-European romanticism. I would not be understood as minimizing or ignoring national differences or forgetting that great artists have created something unique and individual. Still, I hope to have shown that in recent decades a stabilization of opinion has been achieved. One could even say, if we did not suspect the word so much, that progress has been made not only in defining the common features of Romanticism, but in bringing out what is its peculiarity, or even its essence in nature. That attempt, apparently doomed to failure and abandoned by our time, to identify subject and object, to reconcile man and nature, consciousness and unconsciousness by poetry, which is the first and last of all knowledge.